Welcome everyone to the first video edition of our ongoing retro gaming feature, Playback. This time we're going to be taking a look at the bastard cousins of movie games, those unfortunate games based on live-action TV shows. Back in the late 80s, there was a computer game based on the A-Team. It was a serviceable Operation Wolf clone, but it didn't ring very true to the series. Notice here I'm firing at enemies and they're actually getting hit. I would have found it more faithful if you could just shoot near the bad guys and have them fall off balconies into conveniently placed dumpsters and pools. What you might not know is that 4 years earlier there was also to be an A-Team game on the Atari 2600. Created by Howard Scott Warshaw, creator of the legendary E.T. game, this one was a much more faithful recreation of the TV show. It was based on my favorite episode of the show, in which the giant disembodied head of Mr. T has to combat an army of robots by shooting lasers from his eyes. It was broken into 3 different sequences. The first one instructs you, clearly enough, to save Hannibal. Unfortunately, since Hannibal isn't actually in this game, you'll have better luck shooting the robots that are trying to assemble a nuclear missile on the right side of the screen. After that, the action moves inside to the Warhead Factory. Here, Mr. T's head has a showdown with his arch-nemesis, the full body of Colonel Decker. As you might remember, the Colonel is impervious to Mr. T's laser breath, so T has to ricochet his attack off of him to destroy the boxes on the conveyor belt below. This was definitely the best part of the episode, and it's translated well into the game. The last part is, of course, the climactic battle with the clock/egg-roll monster. This is your last chance to stop the missile launch. Fortunately, if you destroyed all the boxes in the previous stage, the clock egg-roll beast has the good sense to kill himself before the match begins. By now it should be pretty obvious that either Mr. Warshaw had never seen an episode of the A-Team, or he was given a couple weeks to retool the latest game he had been working on with a random license regardless of how little sense it made. If you're familiar with Atari's business practices after the departure of Nolan Bushnell, you'll probably bank on the latter. Sadly, the A-Team game was never released, but a couple years ago its original form, Saboteur, was. What do you think of that, Hannibal?
I love it when a plan comes together.
I don't think so. Homie, don't play that.
Homie, don't play that. Not only is it an irreverent catchphrase, but also sound advice for anyone considering Damon Wayans' video game debut. A game which bears the dubious distinction of being the only game based on a comedy sketch without some kind of a movie tie-in. Capstone's adaptation of the In Living Color character is a point-and-click adventure game, which makes a lot of sense for a character-driven franchise. The problem is that turning a 2-minute sketch into a full-length adventure works about as well as you'd think. Unlike Capstone's other crappy licensed adventure games, which used a simple menu-based map to get from scene to scene, Homie has players wander the streets of the post-apocalyptic dystopia the clown calls home. Navigation is no easy task, however, as the streets are littered with defensive linemen there to obstruct your path. Upon encountering one of these pedestrians, you'll be prompted to hurl one of your zany catchphrases at them, but somehow none of them will result in your unimpeded progress. Even worse, there are a lot of thugs, gangsters, and ne'er-do-wells that are keen on filling Homie with lead. If you so much as graze one of these guys, you'll wake up in a hospital back at the beginning of the game. It doesn't matter where you are, if you just slipped for a second, you're right back where you started. You'll accumulate a lot of litter throughout the game, and some of it can be used to make some of these people ease off a bit, but trying to figure out how is a process of unintuitive trial and error. There were some pretty bad licensed adventure games back when the genre was fashionable, but we should all admire the ambition of Homie D. Clown for daring to be completely unplayable. Well before the Addams Family movie officially resurrected the property, Sunsoft released Fester's Quest in 1989. Obviously unsure of how to market this ancient property, Sunsoft went for broke and made what is probably the most frightening box art ever. It features this unpleasant wrinkly man with a lipstick sneer as a spider crawls down his face and a mansion towers ominously in the background. This is Fester alright, but to kids who didn't know anything about TV before the Thundercats, this freak may as well have been the last boss. While most TV shows cum video games are rudimentary platformers, Fester's quest is overhead action with RPG elements. Fester can talk to the Addams family, who give hints and items for their uncle's quest of clearing the city's alien scum. There are upgradable weapons, secret locations, and a huge game world to explore. Fester's quest recycles sound effects and a few enemies from Blaster Master, so it feels almost like a sequel with new sprites inserted at the last minute. It even has those remarkable bosses that take up the whole screen, black out the background so they don't melt the NES. Unfortunately, the game hasn't aged as well as it should have. A large portion of the game takes place in faux 3D mazes that are so nondescript they're virtually impossible to navigate. Coupled with the lack of a save system and high difficulty, ultimately this is a pop culture leftover that could have been more. Lord only knows what made anyone think it was a good idea to turn a sitcom into a video game. Home Improvement Power Tool Pursuit follows the basic rules of licensed shovelware from the early 90s. No matter what the premise, if it's an arcade game, make it a beat-em-up, and if it's a console game, it has to be a platformer. I probably would have liked a Home Improvement beat-em-up more than the clunky nonsense platformer that they came up with. Through the catchphrase-littered intro, I gather that Tim the Toolman Taylor needs to rescue some stolen tools that have, yep, more power. Yes, somehow the developers had managed to perfectly capture the sharp-tongued wit of the show. This quest takes place across different TV sets, the 1994 code word for generic platformer cliches, as Tim is armed with power tools like a nail gun or a magic shooting chainsaw, which he uses to fight dinosaurs or whatever else happens to be on set to kill him. It's also one of the hardest games ever to grace the Super Nintendo, so luckily for you, you won't have to play more than a level or two before you smash the cartridge. Unfortunately for me, I've taken it upon myself to actually try to play this thing for the show. That's been every bit the trial of superhuman determination, I fear. The platforming is clunky, the controls are loose, and the gameplay is just god-awful. Most of the enemies are 3-pixel-tall insects that walk below your line of fire, so at least the game has that going for it. The worlds are ridiculously long, with a whopping 5 levels each of which is its own painful scavenger hunt for 5 or 6 crates. It's a joyless, soulless experience that you have to force yourself to sit through. So in that regard, maybe it's at least a good foreshadowing of Tim Allen's movie career. In any event, it's not hard to see why the developer, the ironically named Absolute Entertainment, went out of business shortly after the game's release. While I do wish that I could play a dozen more of these games, I'm afraid that's all we have for this episode. With Got Next, I'm Travis Foss.